So for my 39th birthday, my birthday present to myself is I bought a life-size Jar Jar who sits in our dining room.
Incredible.
As your daughter's growing up, you're like, this is who we honor and respect and we learn from. I love the fact that your speech about Jar Jar was probably more passionate about the business than the business you run, which was also very passionate. I love it.
I have God, I know we've been talking for an hour and a half. I have a Jar Jar prequel that I've started to write. It's all tied in. Like I was doing I'm not gonna go into it. I have a Jar Jar prequel that I started to write. Because I'm like, how do you humanize how do you make people who are not interested in even listening to like what I just told you about Jar Jar, who are so like closed-minded that they don't even want to hear it, right? Or who are like, he steps in poop and he goes icky icky poo, right? Like and they're like, I don't care, he says that, he's horrible, I'm not listening to you. How do you reach somebody like that? And I'm in the midst of writing a prequel for Jar Jar, which takes place like 10 years before the Phantom Menace.
That
where
sounds amazing.
Jar Jar is the top cadet in the Otagunga City Police Force. And Captain Tarples at that time is the police chief. And Jar Jar has scored higher than anybody in the history of the police cadets. And at the end, Tarples is like, Jar Jar, you have your pick. And Jar Jar's voice at this time is like more like my voice. He's like, oh, yeah, a little bit more in here. And so that night, Jar Jar and all the other cadets go out to like the Otagunga bar and are all drinking and celebrating, and everybody is celebrating Jar Jar, who scored perfect on all of his tests. And the bartender comes over and is like, Jar Jar, come here, come here. And so like he goes off to the back while everybody's celebrating, in the foreground, and he's on the phone. He's like, and like he just drops. And his fiance, the love of his life, who he's known since they were tadpoles, is a marine biologist who is studying life and changing currents in the ocean, in the planet core, and was killed by a Sando aqua monster. And at that moment, Jar Jar's entire life changes. Like, he doesn't want to be in the police force. He goes above the city on the outskirts of the swamp and lives above the swamp and starts sucking on poison toads. And the more he's just trying to kill himself. Like, he's not going to actually kill himself, but he's just like doing drugs and just like his skin is drying out. He doesn't go underwater anymore. And the more toad venom he sucks, the higher his voice goes, because it's ruining his vocal cords, and not being in the water is ruining all of this. So it's been like 3 or 4 years since this happens. And he gets a knock on his door one day. And he's like passed out, hungover. Tarples kicks in the door. Jar Jar! Get up, Jar Jar! Tarples explains that a prominent child from the Naboo has been kidnapped. One of the senator's children has been kidnapped. And the Naboo press has blamed the Gungan race for this. And it's a very sensitive thing, and the Gungans don't even want to validate the claim with like an investigation or anything. So Boss Nass has tasked Captain Tarples to go undercover and discover who actually kidnapped this child. And Tarples, because he can't go with anybody else in the police force or everybody, goes to Jar Jar, his top cadet of all time, and says, I need you for this. Your people need you for this. So he gets Jar Jar out, and, Jar Jar at this point, even at half capacity, is still better than so many of the police force. And Jar Jar and Tarpals go on a buddy cop adventure to discover who kidnapped this Naboo child. Some like think like Lethal Weapon, right? Danny Glover and Mel Gibson. And throughout it, all the things that you learn about Jar Jar in episode 1, like crashed the boss's hay blibber and flooded the Otogunga City Zoo and all of these things that he does in the name of trying to track down the person who kidnapped this child. And so eventually Tarpals and Jar Jar at the end recover this baby and return it to the Naboo. But the wake of destruction and the whole thing, like, it needs to be covered up. And when they have a private meeting between Boss Nass and Tarpals, and they're like, Jar Jar, you're a hero. Like, what are we gonna do? Jar Jar's like, I'm gonna take the blame. I don't want to live anymore anyway. Like, my life is already forfeit. Like, I don't want to. Like, I came out of my hole to save the Gungans. Put it all on me. So Boss Nass decrees publicly that Jar Jar is banished for doing all this shit. And Jar Jar takes the blame for the whole Gungan race. And he goes back to his spot and just feels a sense of pride. So he starts to clean himself up. But he's just going to live out the rest of his days there until he bumps into Qui-Gon Jinn.
You're going to make me fucking cry, dude. That's just...
Here's the crazy thing. So the credits roll, right? The after credits scene is Palpatine is the one who orchestrated the kidnapping of the child, because he thought if there was a race war between the Gungans and the Naboo, it would be easier to take over the planet in the events of Star Wars Episode 1. And if you think about it, the Gungans are what saved the planet. It was that unification. So Palpatine knew that that would be dangerous, and he had put plans in motion. So when Jar Jar and the Gungans foiled his plans there, he goes to Jar Jar and manipulates Jar Jar to give him the power that brings about the fall. Jar Jar's a tragic character.
As Kevin would say, take all my fucking money. That sounds incredible.
And you think about it, every time you see Jar Jar then do something stupid, or you want to roll your eyes at him in episode 1 or episode 2, with that foundation, you're not looking at him as like this stupid idiot. You're looking at him as a hero who's like done everything for his people and still has no respect.
Oh, I love you. Just, oh.